Welcome. Good evening, class. I appreciate the flexibility here and meeting up with me virtually. In particular, obviously, we're talking about Chapter 6 tonight. Please let me know if you have missed the quiz. It will open at the beginning of class, 6 p.m., close at the end of class, which obviously is 8:50 p.m. Anytime during then you can take there is only one particular attempt. So as always, the 10 questions and the lowest score will be dropped. Also, there's a couple things in the resources that I added, this link being one of those. Hopefully, obviously, you're already seeing that. And then, of course, the second video is, I think it's about 12 minutes or so of a good example of conceptualization and questioning around that conceptualization through cognitive behavior therapy. One of the tasks I would like to suggest for next time we are meeting is going to be talking about a particular modality that maybe you would start to frame things in. So be thinking about that. It doesn't have to be solidified. It's not for the rest of your life. It's just in particular something you could conceptualize for this particular class period. We do have also, I will send an email around, I lined up the guest speaker. I was able to get in contact just through my own shortcomings. I didn't get in contact earlier. So I did line up the speaker for the week after we are off here. So not the 17th, but that following week in particular, that next Thursday, let's see here, would be the 24th. So I will catch up with you on that in particular as far as that meeting is concerned, so that we have the ability to get a little more in depth than just the tertiary glance I gave about research. So that's a little bit of the housekeeping, I would say, the tidying up some loose ends here. And then for us, Chapter 6, assessment is a vital component. It really is in particularly vital, I should say, in that really assessment obviously is going to be, whether formal or informal, all throughout, and also helps us conceptualize, helps us do all these things that we're going to talk about here tonight. So here's those particular items. If you see me looking up, by the way, I have a dual screen, so that two things are happening at once, just so I can stay on track with everything and match the recording. So we are talking about the assessment as a vital component, and then writing effective assessment reports. We might go over that a little more quickly, just so this doesn't drone on too long. I know it's difficult to attend to over video when you're not in person. It's a little hard later in the evening like this is to stay on track. So I won't bore you for an entire 3 hours. We'll move through this stuff and then we'll pick up some things. We have some flexibility in our schedule the next time we meet, so that we can maybe practice a few pieces of these. Like I said, in particular, thinking about your modality and how that would conceptualize a particular case. So assessment really is very purposeful, or should be very purposeful. In particular, screening, diagnosis, case conceptualization, treatment planning, goal identification, evaluating client progress is all some sort of assessment, whether formal or informal. Keep in mind, testing may be the more formal terminology. We're talking about a specific test. And then overall assessment in general, impressions, conceptualizations, how each piece of the screening, etc., would indeed impact our overall counseling process, conceptualization. So screening, we have talked about those. In particular, it's the first stage in the counseling process. You're gathering that information. Intake is part of that. The initial intake, all those different questions, all those different answers. There's plenty of different lengths of intakes out there. So be aware that most of that is going to probably be dictated by where you work, what particular screeners and how they funnel down and how they have that kind of narrowing effect to arrive at a particular conclusion. It easily allows development of quick, cost-effective snapshot. And keep in mind, again, just like we've talked about in class, that snapshot is just much like the window of stats. It is a snapshot. It gives you a good picture of what's happening. It does not guarantee 100% accuracy, but we can make reasonable assumptions. And I know we never really talk about making assumptions, but I would maybe say educated guess is a better way to say that. A reasonable understanding, a reasonable snapshot of that client, given the information we've gathered, and it directs the process. It helps determine that next step. All right, where are we going whenever they spike on anxiety, for example? Progress begins almost immediately. So that assessment goes both ways when it begins immediately. So like we said in this initial phrase or phase is that, okay, they're thinking something about me, I'm thinking about something that them, and now, okay, where are we going from here? Handshakes, eye contact, friendly greetings, all those things are taking into account. It's something we pay attention to, it's something the client pays attention to, and then off to the races. There we go. We're right into that counseling session. Again, thinking about that as a snapshot, it begins to give us information. It does not guarantee a concrete observation. We're beginning to hold stuff and say, I wonder, and hold that information that we take in as just that information, not necessarily a requirement or a must or an absolute guaranteed outcome. So initial assessment, the vast majority, believe it or not, you may have heard this estimation already, depending on the researcher, where you look into, what kind of research you look into, it's from anywhere 70% to 93% nonverbal communication. That's how much communication comes through, or that's, I would say, the amount the average person judges just through the nonverbal. How is this person sitting? How are they presenting? Are they doing one of these and kind of to the side? Are they looking more on? It's all part of this initial intake, part of this initial screening process, just getting a feel, getting an idea for how this client may be presenting. Appearance, we always pay attention to the appearance, again, without being judgmental, but taking that for information. Motor skills, those can say something about, slowed down motor skills or sped up motor skills, or, really constant movement and all kinds of things like that. What do we pay attention to? Is it significant? Is it not? Again, another piece. Nothing's taken as a vacuum or in a vacuum. Motivation, is the client motivated, right? Or referral source has often to do with that, in that, well, if they're court ordered, they're probably going to be less motivated, or maybe they'll be more motivated. There's, again, investigating, at least paying attention, trying to get a feel for that, tending to that in that screening process. Maybe there's a few questions. What brought you here today? Why are you here today? Why questions get a little sticky. Obviously, sometimes whys never end. But there is some sort of information about that motivation. Who presents, there's a lot of times there's good information about who comes in with the client, and do they do all the talking, or does the actual client do all the talking? Do they cut them off? Do they interrupt constantly? Do they stop the other person and correct them and say, no, this is what, all that can be information about what is happening for that particular presenting issue, for that presenting client. Voluntary, involuntary, again, obviously that would come around, court orders. It provides information about a client's past functioning and how it relates to their current situation. So understanding where somebody come from. So I think of it often like this. If I walk through a mud puddle and I'm no longer in that mud puddle, I'm probably going to have a little dirt, a little mud on my shoes, it gives me an information to maybe how my parking lot is. I'm not requiring the client to be quote unquote dirty, or that they're, I don't know, whatever we would assign to those muddy shoes. But I would say to myself, at some point, they walked through a mud puddle, or well, they walked through mud, or they got dirty somehow. And then I wonder about what brought that on, and are they still living that out now? Or are they really worried about that? Are they self-conscious? The past impacts, but does not demand the current situation. Certainly there's impact. It doesn't have to be deterministic and the only thing. We really do in that screening process begin to get an open idea of what that person's description of their issues are. All those things come through. Interpersonal style and skills we're paying attention to. The personal history we're gathering a bit more. Most places I'm aware of have some sort of formal personal history, and then we talk about the high points upon that first session. Maybe you are that person that gains the kind of at the same time you gain the personal history as you're talking about the high points. Maybe the personal history is done separately by a second person, and you just get the information. It all depends. Each place works out a little bit different. Each employer, I should say. Most of these important areas in the initial assessment and the screening, they're kind of one and the same. You're really screening in that initial assessment. Demographic information is usually there, name, address, that type of stuff, current situation, previous counseling experience. You can ask about that. Most places will have that checked somewhere. Do you know what counseling is? Do you have an idea what that operates like? You talk about birth and developmental history. Was there, oh yeah, I had this major surgery, family history, medical history, all these different things, all these different domains more exactly are part of that initial screening. So it takes some time. Usually 45 to 50-minute session is not enough. You get into that second one. Maybe sometimes you get lucky, you work at a place that gives you an hour and a half for that first initial assessment, but most likely that doesn't happen. Most places bound to an hour kind of operational segments. The interesting thing about this is that even as you hear me talk about all these different things, I could imagine that asking about where I've been as a person in my life and what I've gone through in any of these domains would start to get a little nerve-wracking perhaps, or stirring things up. I think of it as like sediment on the bottom of a pond. You walk through there, you start talking about this stuff and the water gets cloudy. So there's some sort of rapport that needs to be established. Part of establishing rapport is that initial first contact. Are we friendly? Are we inviting? Do we have a warm tone in our voice? Do we engage that person, even however short it is, to set up the appointment with a please and a thank you? And well, I appreciate you coming in, and I look forward to meeting with you. Little bits of encouragement, little friendly, kind words that would set the tone that we are engaged with this person in the process, not just dictating something to them, will absolutely help that rapport. And obviously, that rapport will support all these types of questions that I would imagine they don't talk to strangers about every day the first time they meet them. Hi, my name is David, and my current situation is I'm getting divorced. It's probably not our common greetings, and yet if we think about it that way, in our initial first few minutes, we're asking somebody details like that already. So establishing that rapport with them, like relaxing ourselves, taking a breath maybe before we start, having that ability to ease into getting to know them and having them be okay with wherever they're at, and maybe making a quick comment like, it's okay, I know this might be a little awkward. Establishing that rapport can go a long way in the initial session, but it is a lasting effect towards all of the sessions to say, hey, this counselor has my back, so to speak. So diagnosis after that screening, really these ideas start to lead us towards this. Okay, when they're talking about really being anxious and they're not getting very much sleep and maybe they're irritable, and like, okay, now I have a few ideas about maybe anxiety or depression, but I'm not quite sure. So we're looking at this diagnostic really for a particular process of learning more about the client. at best, in the best case scenario of diagnosis, it is learning more about the client and helping us understand them. In the worst case scenario, it's putting a label down and saying, okay, now this is what we operate with because this is what the diagnosis said. That is leaving the person out and referring to them through their diagnosis, quote unquote, how we fix anxiety. It's not really going to be how we fix anxiety for everybody. And we shouldn't really often even think about fixing the anxiety. It's about helping something through. So the goal depends on the purpose and the setting of the counseling relationship. Obviously, there's operating parties out there that force our hand in one direction or another. We have to produce some kind of paperwork for most places, which requires some sort of assessment and results oriented kind of focus. That's not the only piece. It can be a driving piece, unfortunately, but in quality counseling and helping somebody actually change, it's not the only piece. And that diagnosis that we come into helps us understand what's happening for the client, doesn't guarantee that that's how the client operates or what they're going to be like, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. So again, it's clinical in nature. It is technical. We should have a standardized approach, and we should not land on only diagnosis and say, now that's it with the client. The DSM-5 obviously has all those different diagnoses. I know in another class we'll talk much about those, and the diagnostic process much more specifically. This in particular is a part of what we're talking about in this class, to help with the conceptualization overall, which is assessment lived out, I would say. Assessment operationalized for our purposes is in counseling. And by the way, two things that I always kind of had a hang up with, or kind of a little scratch in my head and didn't necessarily understand. One would be the word conceptualization. I just never could really put my mind on that word and understand what people are talking about. And so the conceptualization was the overall thought, or their overall impressions of the client and how we understand this process. So conceptualization is the whole concept of the client, including how we view them through whatever modality we happen to select, and understand and operate in. So that's conceptualization. And then operationalize, that's a big word I've always kind of scratched my head at, is how we actually put something into practice. Like, what am I going to do with this academic or knowledge-based information that then carries out into an actual practical way that I conduct something? That is impacted by diagnosis, by screening, by all these pieces. It helps us actually put into practice what we're working on professionally up here in our minds. So accurate diagnosis is important. It is important to have an understanding of diagnosis of trends. Likelihoods are not guarantees of how a depressed person is or operates, how a anxious person operates. What understanding most typically comes through your modality would inform that diagnosis of how concrete. If you're behavioralist, diagnosis is held a little more concretely than perhaps emotion-focused therapy. So it also ensures accurate communication with other providers. I would say accurate because we've all had agreed upon terms. So maybe the accuracy of that diagnosis can be argued, but the utility of understanding, when somebody says anxiety, we all think, oh, that's the picture of anxiety. Here it is. So it creates that communication ability. We all know what we're talking about. So here's case conceptualization, that big word I was saying. Here's this big fancy term, a method, a clinical strategy for obtaining an ordinance, right? And it's this entire paragraph. Really, how do I think about my client? Where do I see them? And where do I see the picture of health moving towards? One of the most integral components, without a doubt. This conceptualization basically says, where's my client been? Where's my client currently at? And what interests do they have in accomplishing in the future? And now, since I have this conceptualization of like 1, 2, 3, then I say, okay, where are they at currently, and how am I going to operate with them? How am I going to conduct this thing called therapy here and now, in the live, in the real time. That is conceptualization lived out. It's not just meant to be this separate kind of academic thing here, and then we do something different here. It should influence, it should impact. That's why it's so integral. There are distinct phases in conceptualization, and this is kind of an overall conceptualization as opposed to maybe a more specific conceptualization. So, for instance, if you were operating in emotion focused therapy or an attachment lens, you might be talking about attachment or early attachment. You might be talking about cognitive distortions in CBT. You might be talking about awareness or lack of awareness in Gestalt. You could be talking about personality and archaeological thoughts in psychodynamic, the id, the ego, and the superego. Whereas so all these different things impact more specifically, but then there's this overall part of conceptualization. Diagnostic formulation, right? Gather as much information as we can to help us understand. Diagnostic, not just in landing on a diagnosis, but understanding, right? There's more than diagnostics can be what happened. How do I diagnose what you're doing, what you're thinking? Where is that coming from? What's those origins and sources? The clinical formalization, like organizing this information, collecting it into a meaningful manner, using our theory to say, okay, well, when they say this, I understand it through my CBT lens to be distorted thinking. Like I said, the black and white thinking, maybe it is. And so we begin to understand where the picture of not such a healthy functioning is, how that's operating, and then what our theory says is the way to help them engage in a more healthful operation and a more healthy decision going forward, which is then impacted by the cultural formulation. Obviously, an American cultural background is going to understand something differently in the sense of individualism as would a much more collective society, like perhaps a Hispanic or a person in India. There would be very different implications to the roles and responsibility towards family and how that culture impacts. And so, when we say something very individually colloquial, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, maybe the next culture says, well, how does my family help support me and I'm not in this alone? And is that enmeshed or is that differentiation of self? Enmeshed is one word that we might use through our conceptualization, and differentiation of self is another one, Bowen. Now the question is that culturally impacted? And do I understand my theory enough to know where that cultural formulation impacts my understanding? And then the treatment, establish those goals. Okay, what's next? Where's these interventions? Just like we were saying, monitor the progress and assess the outcomes. So we're selecting the interventions much through our conceptualization, and then we're understanding how that moves forward. We understand what that progress looks like through our conceptualization, through our modalities most typically, and then assess the outcomes. Okay, the outcome is less anxiety. The outcome is to feel the anxiety. The outcome is to be able to walk through the anxiety, what those outcomes say. And then, there is efficacy of a case conceptualization. In other words, if we have this conceptualization, this overall idea, right, and then there is no impact or very general thought of like, oh, they're anxious, and I would like them not to be anxious. Well, that's a conceptualization, but not necessarily a terribly detailed or information-filled conceptualization. What does that mean? How does that look? What does that mean moving forward? And then obviously you could see a degree in that. Okay, if they're anxious, and well, I understand they're anxious to be, say, an adaptation, because that's how they had enough energy to get through the dangerous situation. They had to be anxiety ridden and get to the other side so that they were safe. Well, that makes sense. And now, do I understand that to say, okay, well, that was an impact of their past, and now how do I engage the here and now and say to them, perhaps my modality says, well, can you stop your thoughts and move on from there? maybe this is in a dangerous situation, right? So now you can see how the conceptualization has a low, moderate, high efficacy. Like it may impact it. If your case conceptualization doesn't impact much of what you do or how you operate in session, then it's on the lower side. If you have a more in-depth understanding, you have a detail, and this takes some time to understand, like, oh, when they said this, it tied to that, which meant, okay, this is how they operated in their anxiety. There's more conceptualization at a higher level that would be impacting, hopefully impacting your sessions. So it actually looks like my whole computer froze, so I'm not sure if I'm even recording. Let's see if, oh, I see what happened. My apologies, it looks like my mouse batteries died. So I'm gonna switch this out and go to my touchpad. There we go. Developing client treatment plans. So through our diagnosis, through our conceptualization, through our modalities, now we're into, okay, what's this treatment plan? The treatment plan then is an important part of the counseling process. Where am I starting? Where I want to head to? What do I want to do in that? This roadmap, a framework, of this framework, roadmaps. I like this idea because, right, there's a lot of ways to get from point A to point B on a roadmap. This happens to be one of them, and this is the route and why I chose the route to get from point A to point B, all informed by these previous pieces that lead up to my treatment plan. So it should be logical. Assessment results fit the given environmental context. You know, if they're in a work context or a home context, it's going to be a little bit different. There's probably an accomplishment at work that they need to get done or required to get done by the end of the day, as opposed to home. There's a little bit more. So maybe the goals are a little bit impacting. So obviously the context matters. Client driven, well, if there's no understanding, or we hand them a treatment plan and say, here, this is what we're going to do, and they don't understand 50% of the words, or they look at it and say, well, I wasn't really anxious, I'm more nervous, and they don't understand the word anxiety, it's not going to be much use. They're not going to have much engagement, and they're probably not going to really be invested very deeply. So the client-driven treatment plan, a collaborative treatment plan, gives us the chance to engage more deeply, and that would be not only informed by our clinical mindset, that modality, but also by those other pieces of diagnosis and screening that gives us the information to translate into client understanding or understandable terms. And then also, because we have this treatment plan in place, they can say to somebody, or we could say to somebody, like perhaps in insurance, this is what we're doing, and this is the direction we're heading, right? And so now the treatment plans have this benefit to some other people and these additional parties that says, okay, yeah, they're doing something here. All companies, all insurance companies want to know that they're paying for something that is producing something positive towards results. That helps, or I should say, treatment plans help with that understanding. Okay, this counselor is actually doing something, quote unquote. So obviously there's a little tension there that's being driven by this hard factor, and there's this bit of process dynamic human that is happening. And so how do we marry those two? And there is the professional practice of counseling. Okay, we are working towards result in a measurable way, and there might be something intangible, but I have a framework that I'm operating in to support that kind of hard to describe thing of counseling that we're accomplishing. Really basic treatment plans, operational, defining the problem. Here's the target problem, here's the first problem, here's the next problem. This is how we're going to get down through it. Measurable, challenging yet attainable. I think of this treatment goal as just that. Okay, well, it needs to be measurable. Some sort of reduction in anxiety usually is measurable. Challenging yet attainable. So, the overall goals and then the specific goal. I'll share some resources that'll have a SMART goal in there, and it kind of lays out the very specific short-term goals that are measurable, time sensitive, and have all these components to create a good goal. It's a combination of process and outcome goals, which is really a fine thing. It takes practice. I'm still practicing. You'll still be practicing years into that because of that thing that we were talking about just a moment ago with the insurance and the outside parties dictating these kind of things. We now have to have something that's an outcome, as well as, well, we want to actually affect real change for our clients. So there might be a bit of something in that process that's intangible. And they're like, well, yes, I'm less anxious. Okay, so at least we can measure something. Maybe they don't know exactly how your therapy helped them get there, but it is getting there. The more we can define how we actually got there, the more likely we are able to reproduce that goal or those results. The funny thing about that is those results look maybe a little different for each person. So that's another reason to have client-driven treatment plans. So selecting the counseling interventions, oftentimes are going to be input from your modality, from your case conceptualization, which is right back to why having a modality framework, at least to operate from, is greatly helpful. Where maybe in a CBT intervention, you would do a thought-stopping exercise. Here's the thought. Here's what I want to stop. When I come up, I say 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. Whereas in a different intervention, say from emotion focused therapy, you might be heightening the emotion and allowing them to experience that emotion in such a way that they can have some sort of understanding how they want to move forward, right? So then this leads into the evaluation of client progress, formative, summative evaluations. Formative, real-time assessments during counseling, process to determine the efficacy of treatment. Like, it's forming something, it's formative in that counseling session. And it helps create something for us to focus on, to say we are doing or aren't doing after what we want to be after that kind of change. Are we after what we're after, so to speak? Summative evaluation then occurs at the end of the counseling process, and it assesses those outcomes very clearly. Okay, did we accomplish what we actually said we wanted to accomplish in the grand total kind of sense? So all those things lead up to these effective assessment reports. So now, shifting gears a little bit, I would say most assessment reports include assessment/testing report. That's kind of the idea and the way through that. I'm going to kind of go quickly through this part. We'll talk more about this. I'll show you an example in class when we meet again, when we have that time together. Suffice to say, assessment reports don't necessarily happen for everybody. Psychologists are really into assessment reports. That's what they do. They administer the testing, they have the assessment, they marry those two together, they put them in a report, and they reproduce that result again and again for each client that they go through that procedure. So sometimes in counseling, you don't get into, I should say a number of times in counseling, really, you don't get into assessment reports unless specifically your agency has a contract with something to do some sort of more particular assessment, that you maybe say a ministerial evaluation, that you're something specific and you're producing a result for that, to that end, to that means. So there's primary objectives in the assessment report. Really, it provides the accurate aspects to the referral, right? I want to provide something accurate. Assessment related aspects, here they are. Serve as a source of clinical hypothesis. Okay, this is what I think is happening. This is where I think the issues are, and this is what I think we need to speak to. All right, furnish meaningful baseline. Where are they actually at now? The progress after the interventions have been implemented, changes that occur as a result of real time. So that can be a little more program eval, understanding if what we did actually affected that. So we need that baseline, and then we need that something after. Oftentimes, assessment reports create that baseline, and really things are taken from there. You may see after the fact assessment reports, but they're not as common in most of probably the areas that we'll be involved in as counselors. Um, they serve as a legal document, or they can serve as a legal document. In particular, you can get really into that legal side of things and do a lot of assessments and basically testify that your assessment is accurate. Again, it's its own niche that I know we mentioned a class or two ago. So there is a particular structure to most assessment reports. Most frequently, the assessment reports I have seen, that's, and again, this is colloquial, it's not hard research, is test oriented. You know, here's the test, here's the result. Here's the other test, here's this result. And you see kind of a test battery report. And then even in that respect, here's the general impression, here's the more diagnostic impression, here's the actual testing impressions, here's their personal impression, right? So it's each test, each assessment kind of. And then there's domain, where you might be reporting on specific domains like, oh, personality for lethal weapons clearance, for example. You know, they're more interested in the domains of, you know, stability, personality. And so you kind of report on the domain, and it's one giant assessment, maybe not so many different assessments, could be, but it's more domain oriented. Hypothesis testing, again, it's arranged in a way that supports the diagnosis. So here it is, and that's usually more formal, more medical model kind of something that is produced in those types of assessment reports, the hypothesis testing, that is. So basic parts of the report: there's a reason, there's an assessment procedure, this is what we did, there's background information, here's the basics of this person, behavioral observations, they were really nervous, they were anxious, they whatever, right? Behavioral type stuff. Here's the test results. Here's my interpretations as a professional. Here's what I conclude from those interpretations and scorings as a professional. And then here's what I recommend based on all this other information put together as a whole. Maybe we recommend counseling, or we recommend a continued course of action towards anger management, something like that. So if you present the assessment report, more than likely you're going to have a standard procedure for this, where there's a time you get back together and, or I should say, if you're doing assessment reports, more than likely you have some sort of time that you'll be going over that with a client. Sometimes you'll do the report, and then the other person that actually administered the testing takes that report. Basically, you become a ghostwriter, and then they go over that results more directly with the client. That's pretty frequent, especially for those who are learning the psychological side of things, or the psychology side of things, I should say, in testing and all that. You get a feel for how to write that report, and then basically a psychologist says thank you, and they go deliver the results. So you're scheduling that time. It's never just said, here you go. We're always explaining those results. You're giving them the opportunity. Ask here, what do you have there? What do you understand about this? What do you don't understand about that? When children are clients, you make sure the parent or guardian is present. Explanation again, in an understandable way. Right, report only the information supported by the assessment. Skip the opinions, or it was rainy that day. You're focusing on that particular information created in the report. Technical jargon is only between technicians, so other professionals, not with the client. So if you skip that jargon and you explain it in obviously an understandable way, and that supports everything. Like if they're not understanding, then what's the point of the assessment? What's the point of the report? Now you're writing to an audience in that assessment in 9 out of 10 assessment reports. Most of the time, clients aren't taking that assessment just because they want to understand their own results. It's to an end for the employer, for the school, for the behavioral specialist, for whomever might be involved. So they're written to an end. Those clients are included so they can understand, because it is their information. But the intent usually is shaped towards one specific thing. So really that is the assessment writing in a nutshell. So I would encourage you to think about a few different things. And one of those is you may or may not be involved in assessment report writing. Fine, no problem there. Which then also means that, let me stop sharing here for a second. Okay, which also means that, okay, I might not be involved in a formal session so much so, um, or formal assessment report writing, um, but you are going to be involved in assessment in some way. So then we need to understand how we think as a professional about that assessment, which then is back to what I started with. It is informed by our conceptualization, which is very much formulated on our modalities. So I'm going to share some of those links in the resources section on e-learning. Take some time during class. Hopefully this isn't taking up all your night, all your class time, I should say, and you'll be able to hop on this website. It gives you a little idea of what modality you may be interested in or what modality you're operating from. And then there's that other video link too that has a young lady talking about her anxiety, and you'll see that good bit of conceptualization there. So then we'll take this all together in class. We'll talk about this more. Maybe we'll practice one as a class or get some pieces of this down as a class. But everything you'll need will be in the resources, and hopefully you can access it. Of course, always email me. Let me know if you can't access it. I'll make sure that information is up there. So at least we have some time, of course. Don't forget about your APA papers. I know as if you could forget, right? So that is coming up here this Saturday, the 17th, 11:55 p.m. due. And feel free again. At this point, I assume most of those are getting wrapped up. But if you do have any questions, feel free as well. All right, thank you much. Enjoy the rest of your evening and have a good night, folks.